Thank you all for coming. Thank you, Sophia, for sitting down, but also for this collaboration together. Let's start actually talking about the piece itself. So when I first was invited to collaborate with you, as you know, I was expecting a different kind of piece, and I think this is exciting because it's a continuation of your work, but also quite new. So let's walk through a little bit about your inspiration and your thoughts, but also unpack some of the imagery that's there for people.
Sure. So I guess to start on a very personal note, this was the first piece I designed and made since having my baby. And so, there's a lot of those themes are in the piece. There's the mother and child in a hospital bed kind of, rolling down this sand path into this underwater area where there's another mother and child, and a lot of just the experience postpartum and breastfeeding and kind of the physical, emotional, realities of that, all filtered into this work. I don't know where I will just ramble, but
No, let's talk a little about some of my favorite parts, as you know, are obviously the figure with the shooting breast milk, which I really love. And then also the hospital bed image where you're rolling, not you per se, but a woman is rolling down the sand track. So let's talk about, you have some different couples going on in this, and you have the couple at the fulcrum of the seesaw. So let's talk about some of the different couples that you have and how you see the couples relating in the piece.
Sure. So one of the jumping off points for this piece was actually the couple on the seesaw. And the seesaw is held up by another couple having sex, and they're holding the seesaw as kind of the fulcrum of it. And so there was kind of simultaneously this couple that is in this moment of connection, and then, the two figures on either end of the seesaw are kind of having these very different experiences. So the woman at the top of the seesaw is glancing down at this open book, and the scene that she's looking at was based off a series of lithographs called the Wedding Series by an illustrator, Harrison Fisher, who was working around the turn of the century. So it's this very mass-produced lithograph series that starts with a couple in courtship, and then there's an image of like the trousseau and the wedding and the honeymoon and dinner in their first home, and then the last scene has a caption with their new love, and they have an infant. And it's, a very Victorian kind of very cliche. I mean, I think a lot of people might have a response to this, that it's just totally kitschy or sentimental, like at best. And it is, but it's also, there is this charm and sweetness to it. And, it's very superficial and it's very buttoned up. And it's kind of this like top skimmed view of these experiences that are so, transcendent and universal, and also so unique to each person, and, wild and eye-opening and isolating all at the same time, and so much messier than this, series of illustrations. But yet there is something in that series which I connected to and found very compelling. And so, they became this shorthand, and the woman is looking at an image in the book based on the last lithograph in that series with the infant. And then the man on the other end of the seesaw is looking at a page that's kind of flown out of the book based on this image in the series where the couple is having dinner in their new home. So they're kind of, having their own separate experiences, and then these illustrations also are existing in this world where the woman with, the shooting breast milk is like, there's these footnotes, of this kind of restrained, buttoned up version of the story, but then it's this kind of humorous and freewheeling and kind of out of control version as well. And then, she's there's another figure with her that's kind of joyfully watching her and cheering her on. And I don't know, it's kind of this, I guess, different thing from the illustrations, but also yet they're still kind of there shaping the story in some way, if that makes sense.
Let's talk a little bit about your process. So, in this case, obviously you're talking about these 1912 lithographs, and I didn't realize you can go online and actually see them because I hadn't seen what they were when we were talking. So if you're interested, you can go kind of see. They are quite kind of buttoned up or restrained in a romantic sense. So I'm wondering about some of your other works or what you're working on now. Is that how you tend to start? Are you starting sometimes with a reference point? Can you talk a little bit about that?
That is actually very new and kind of unique to this body of work. I have never had such a direct quotation image. They've been changed a little, but if you see, they're pretty recognizable to the originals. In this series, or this, recent work before this, I have had some kind of recurring images of paintings functioning in a kind of similar way, but it is not something I've ever done in the past. Mm-hmm. So it is kind of, exciting. I'm not really sure exactly where it's going, but it is, and I haven't, shown those pieces yet. Just this one. So, I've always worked with images, gathering online and using them to build the collages, but usually they've become completely unrecognizable. One figure might be made up of 5 different figures or just different photographs. So this is the first time it's ever been, a notable connection, I guess.
Let's talk a little bit about your embroidery and how you started working on it. And then do you see a progression from where you started? Obviously, I also saw that work that John referenced 10 years ago. So I have my own thoughts on the progression, but I'm curious to see what you say.
That means so much to me, first of all, just, that you guys saw the work at that time and, have followed it. I first came to embroidery very serendipitously. I was a painter and, I was, at the time, it almost feels very linear, like it was all adding up because I was trying to find a way to have a closer connection with the material and to take more joy in the process because I was always so excited about the narratives and the stories, and then to make the painting, it was just to kind of, fulfill the narrative, but I wasn't invested like at the same way all the way through. And then, I was trying to get outside the rectangle. I was doing drawings on paper doilies and using tree branches and different things that kind of now I see elements in the embroidery. And one day I had some embroidery thread just because I was using it as details. I had made some 4-leaf clovers out of felt, and I was doing the lines in embroidery, and then I was making other sculptures with the thread as details, and then I just kind of one day thought to try doing a drawing in the thread, and very quickly, 1 or 2 or 3 pieces in, it was pretty much, it was rougher, but it was pretty much the way I work now. And it just, something about it really clicked for me. It solved a lot of the problems that I had in painting formally. And the main thing I think it really did for me was it just took away the baggage of trying to make a good figure painting. because I just could not get out of my head in that way, and I didn't have a visual language of what embroidery was or should look like, or I just didn't have a reference point, so it just let me enjoy the process. And I think I just naturally have a very kind of craft mindset of just making it until it's finished, and it kind of dictates when it's finished. It kind of just can't, there's a limit in terms of the legibility that you reach with the thread, where it, you know, gets so thick you can't even sew through it, or just, and it kind of just does push back in a way, which I find really, I mean, I'm such a literal narrative person, and whatever abstraction or materiality that the thread brings in just is very freeing for me in a way.
That's so interesting. So that would, I think, sort of connect to something we talked about when we were working on this together, in how you see spatially unfolding narratives. And that's something I hadn't really thought about ever, actually, while I was writing about it, until you brought it up. So could you talk about that a little bit? Because you're talking about the narratives and how intuitive that process is for you. But the idea of them spatially unfolding, I think, is really interesting.
Yeah, I first, you know, so I read this actually in Susan Stewart's amazing book on longing, and I don't know that I will do it justice, but she talks about the idea of spatially unfolding narrative, and when I read that, it just really clicked for me. This is what I'm doing, or this is what I'm trying to do. And, you know, because as someone working in narrative, you'll always get the question, oh, well, would you ever make a film? Or like, why is it not time-based if narrative is so important? And I feel like this really unlocked it for me, because, you know, something I've been thinking about for a while is kind of using different figures in the piece to symbolize aspects of one experience or one emotion or one fantasy or one story. And so every character kind of has their part, and sometimes they're, in my mind, sort of symbolizing the same person or the same essence. There's the main characters, there's the chorus, there's, you know, and where they are spatially can kind of define, you know, their action, their gesture obviously is part of the narrative, their facial expression, but also where they are spatially in relation to other characters is part of it, and how the eye of the viewer can come in and bounce from place to place and kind of piece the narrative together in their own mind, even while it is this kind of simultaneous situation of frozen. I mean, Susan Stewart was writing about doll houses and amusement parks, and basically anything that has a kind of bracketing around it, a framing, becomes a, you know, invitation for projection and fantasy. The way you can look at, you know, a staged dollhouse, and it just invites the imagination in a way. And I think, you know, working in the miniature for me is also kind of part of that. And, you know, I guess my, like, ultimate hope for my pieces is not necessarily that someone would come and kind of decode, oh, you know, this is what the piece means to Sophia, because there is always that, you know, inner code for me, but more so that they would just kind of have their own emotional experience, or just project their own ideas and read it, you know, however makes sense to them, but that maybe because it does have that inner skeleton of real meaning and purpose, hopefully it gives a ground to, you know, to inspire someone to think about their own story, hopefully.
Well, that's what we were talking about, I think, especially for the breastfeeding and the cabbage imagery that you have. You have these sort of cherubic cabbage. And so it got me thinking about a lot of sort of pop imagery from Cabbage Patch Dolls, which we discussed, obviously, of my 90s childhood, or 80s. And then we were talking about sort of cabbage leaves and breastfeeding and those sort of ancient remedies that I think people at least stop me on the street. I remember always telling me about, and I thought, okay, that's kind of, so I brought all of that, I think, to the piece when I saw the shooting breast milk and how hard breastfeeding can be. And that narrative sort of took me over when I was looking at it, as we talked about. But I think that leads to sort of something I love about the work, which is the humor. And I think all of your work, I was struck by it from the beginning. And when I first saw it, so there's eroticism, which we absolutely have to get to, I think, a little later for your work, but there's humor. And so I'm wondering how you see that in terms of humor and sweetness and bringing that into your artwork, which isn't something that in the contemporary art world I think we think about all the time.
That is definitely something very important to me. I mean, I guess in a nutshell, I've always thought of my work as being about love, and it is just at the core very genuine and, romantic, and sometimes I think to almost do justice to these like very intense feelings, I've sometimes connected with this idea of melodrama or exaggeration, because romantic love or the desire for it or the experience of it or the fantasy of it can be so intense that how can you describe it without just, going so overboard. And I've also always been driven or drawn to kind of cliche symbols like roses or four-leaf clovers or kind of romance. How does it translate visually? And, these symbols kind of have a cheesiness or a clichéness, but then a rose in real life is just the most magical sculptural thing, and there is something so just really transcendent about it. And I think the humor comes in with the melodrama, and it comes in to kind of pierce when the fantasy just comes so overwrought that it topples over, and it reaches that point. And I always think they're funny. I don't know how that comes across, but they also are never sarcastic or ironic, I guess, if that makes sense. And I think especially with this piece, this piece is maybe pushed to the absolute max in terms of this, I guess you could even say sentimentality, or I loved your use of the word nostalgia, because I think, to think about the postpartum time and just the experience of that, it's so sweet and just beautiful that I felt a hard time to even describe it without just it becoming totally cliche and cheesy. And then but I guess with the woman shooting breast milk and the cabbage spinning, I think something I was kind of thinking about very literally was how, breastfeeding is such an intense experience, and so many people have these really personal, and wild experiences with it, and very varied experiences. And yet in many ways it's very invisible, and not just that, people don't talk about it, more so even just that it physically, you don't see the milk actually when, the baby is, if it's working the way you want it to work, it is this kind of, thing that's right there, but it's also not. And it's, so the two women where you see the milk, that was just kind of a very literal image that came out. And the two characters are both, I used figures from certain movies that kind of brought in some humor for me, but also combined them with dancing figures. And the Cabbage Patch Dolls were definitely a reference, which I think also even connected with me for some of the Victorian ideas of finding the baby in the garden, or, this kind of glossed over fairy tale version of things. I don't know if that makes sense, but the cabbage is also, the very, I think, were the symbol, kind of in this piece for me in terms of something that people might connect to in that way.
Let's talk a little bit about, I was always interested in reading about your early love of dollhouses. And then I actually read On Longing, we talked about this, and I couldn't remember what class it was. So it was either sociology or political theory. Because I think that book is published in the 80s.
Yeah.
So I go to college in the 90s. So it's sort of already an established text at that point. And I think there's a section on Marxism. So I think it's a political theory class. But anyway, so I'm familiar with the book, obviously. And I was so interested in the dollhouse and the miniatures and how you think about that in your work. And dollhouses were something that was an early creative field for you in terms of fodder or inspiration as a kid.
Totally. I mean, looking back, I feel like that was the first way I made art, really. Also, growing up, I did a lot of just still lives and, painting for fun, but it was really more so in the dollhouses where I was actually, making ideas, if that makes sense, or if I was exploring and, I made all the furniture and food and like all this stuff for it, so it was really making, but also just the doll play itself, I think really connects to the way I work now and kind of setting up the tableau and, projecting the ideas onto these figures. You also mentioned fairy painting, which I think I really, have connected to not so much that I took inspiration from it, but the writing around fairy painting I really connect to, and the way that, the miniature tableau become this invitation for people to project their own fantasies on, or it's not real life there, since they're fairies. It exists in this other space of kind of permission, and I think that connects to the eroticism for me, because I think the eroticism in my work is often more, for me, symbolic than literal. It's not necessarily about a story of a couple, having sex outside in the grass, although it is in some sense, but it was more, the idea of them balancing this seesaw and kind of being this, moment of connection at, simultaneously with the couple that is disconnected. And in other pieces, there's sometimes been, figures that are kind of meant to symbolize just total beauty or happiness or joy or connection. And other times the eroticism is sort of more, and, kind of thinking of them almost as the chorus, like, as I mentioned earlier, like sometimes there's the main characters in the chorus, and then other times it is kind of like the main characters and it is sort of about that, and, that I'm always coming back to making work about love and just revisiting that in kind of different ways, and eroticism is just a big part of that. So sometimes it is just kind of literally about that, but I think more often the eroticism is kind of a symbol for connection. which it sounds very literal, I guess, but it is kind of a way to visually, note something that everyone can kind of tap into, or this kind of reference to just the human spirit, or something more universal that, is in so much art and movies and music and any kind of media that people can relate to in that way, as this kind of footnote symbol for, a kind of transcendent connection, which really cannot be described in miniature thread, but it's this like visualization of something greater. I don't know if that makes sense, but
Do you, sort of going back a little to the fairy painting, I think something in this piece also that I noticed when I think about the writing, obviously, about or around fairy paintings. And so for people who don't know, obviously, fairy paintings are sort of a genre of paintings that really could explore some of the more kind of erotic, I think you would characterize it that way, kind of stuff going on in Victorian era, but as long as it was about fairies doing it in this fairy land, it was sort of this safe space that people could really explore it. And so I wonder, do you ever think of your work as sort of giving people that safer space or permission to, I think about some of your more erotic kind of orgy works, and kind of do you think of it that way, giving people maybe some space to think about things or look at things that maybe wouldn't feel as safe to them in other?
I do think that has happened. It wasn't something I set out to do. For me, the narratives are always just really intuitive, and I'm kind of it just pops into my head and it goes from there, and I kind of just have to sort of follow what is presenting itself to me. And then, later I'm kind of like, oh, what is happening here, I guess. But I do feel that has happened, especially because of the nature of embroidery. And the other thing is I never really set out to kind of contrast it's the opposite of embroidery is eroticism, or like that this is going to clash in some way. Really, it was just kind of, my work when I was a painter was about love and kind of these themes, and then the material worked for me so well, kind of clicked with the way I wanted to make. And it felt so right to just see the images in the thread. But then as I worked in the thread for more years, I came to understand, so I was always insistent that I was working in the embroidery just for formal reasons. Mm-hmm. And, but really over the years, I came to realize how much the embroidery really does shape the meaning and the experience of the images for people. And I do think that is a big part of it, kind of to go back to your question. They're not photographs, they're not a video, and these kind of interactions would be a very different thing than in thread. And, I've heard someone had said that the thread almost like protects the images in a way. I thought that was interesting. It wasn't something, I thought of ahead of time, but I've had even people say that I think people sometimes have given the images a chance in a way they might not have in another media, if they were not necessarily interested in the subject matter, because you can see, and again, this is not why I work in this media, but it does take so long that, I work on a piece for months, and I think that registers to when something has just been touched that long by the human hand, and it almost gets a little bit more trust from the viewer, maybe, that this person must really mean this or care about this, and on some level that registers, and maybe they give it a chance or it's just less threatening. It's also just less graphic. I always think it is kind of interesting when people are, find them very explicit, because, it's not how I think of them, although I'm also just so in the process that it's, I don't have really an outside view, but to me, it's not, it's thread. It's very miniature. It's I don't find them really that graphic, although sometimes I guess, there's a range, I guess, in where pieces would be on, level of explicit or graphic, but
are you surprised also sort of in terms of people's reactions? And you and I talked about this a little bit. We don't get into it. I don't get into it in the piece, but some of the reactions also just in general when you're working in this medium, and some of the conversations around kind of gendered implications people start to talk about, right? That's sort of where people go with thread. And so I just kind of always wonder, I've asked other textile artists that we've talked about before, that for other magazine pieces, kind of how they push back against that in their own, or if it's something maybe you doesn't bother you. But I know for some people, and as a journalist, I try so hard to avoid those kind of discussions or cliches even in my own writing, if that makes sense.
It does. And I mean, I think I was so excited about the way you really got into the content of the piece, because I do think sometimes the embroidery, I mean, if we're talking about like protects the imagery, sometimes it almost protects it too much, where the conversation ends there. And it's, amazing if someone is excited about the construction of the piece and wants to talk about that, but sometimes it just kind of ends there, and I care more about the narrative in a way, not to compare it, but yeah, I do. That is what motivates it. Like I could see, I would never say I'm gonna certainly embroider forever, but I know that I'll make always work in this narrative way. I think I was more self-conscious about that when I first started working in embroidery, and I think that's why I was always kind of so insistent that it was for formal reasons, and like that was the end of it, and I was not really, I had, it was a very, and just an amazing experience for me seeing the Unmonumental show at the New Museum when I had just started working in thread. And so there was all of this art made of all kinds of materials and trash and cardboard and clothes. And, it was just made me think, well, thread is just another material. I think I respected and connected to, the history of feminist art that had made craft material a fine art material, and I felt, well, they achieved that, and now it's here and it's on the table, and I'm not making a political statement about women's work or history or anything. Like, I just am excited about the set palette and building an image really slowly in lines, and but all to say that after now like 15 or more years working in it, I do feel differently, where it's just, I think, undeniable that the way of constructing it, it does shape the meaning, and it was part of why it felt so right to me and it clicked so much, was that connection to that history, because that is a lot of the content that and it's not that I set out to explore this content. I mean, I'm always kind of just making a story that's very personal to me about my own experience or a fantasy that I have or a desire that I have. But then when I take a step back after finishing a piece, like, I can look at it and say, well, okay, of course, this is how the wedding series functions, as this like Victorian thing, and about, the restrictions and what it meant to be a woman in that time versus this time. And, I think that is something I am really captivated by, the kind of restraints, but also like freedom within exploring that. And that resonates with the embroidery in a very deep way. So I guess, in many senses, it's not, to go back to your question, it's not something that I really think about or bothers me, but it is a very central aspect of the work and the meaning, for sure.
Yeah, it's so interesting, because I think so many people would look at your work and say, if we had to categorize it, that it is really feminist. Both in terms of use of the medium, but also very much in terms of the imagery, in the best kind of way, in terms of taking these powerful images, and most of the time the women are really, they have agency in your narrative. So that's just interesting to me, of how you're kind of thinking about that.
I'm happy you say that, because I do see it that way too. It's been interesting, that is not always the way people see it. But I think what I've learned is that, my goal is to kind of create a situation where people do almost see what they want to see, And so sometimes people see something very different, and it's, I think to work in such a personal way, in such a narrative way, I kind of have to let go of, that to a certain extent, how people will read it in the end. Although, yeah, I have my own relationship to it, which, so I'm happy you see it that way, though.
Let's shift for a minute and talk a little bit about some of the imagery, both in this work, but also I love in other works. Well, in this one, I love the icing, as you know, but I love that it's such a, there's so many unexpected. It's one of those pieces where you truly have to look at it for a very long time, very carefully, and then you could go back to it again. And I think all the pieces of yours that I've seen really use an incredible amount of source material imagery. So let's talk a little bit about, you go into your studio and your actual process of how you're looking at imagery, thinking about imagery. You talk about the internet, obviously. Perhaps if you're working on a piece right now, obviously just how do you approach that?
Yeah, so for a large piece, it always starts with a story. And so it kind of, starts in my mind with the story. And, this piece started with the idea with the seesaw. And, then I start collaging. And I think I collaged this one for probably 5 weeks. So it sometimes is a very, just long, playful process where I'm listening to music and just, building these Photoshop collages with hundreds of layers and, making the people out of just images of all different people and screenshots of movies and TV and sources online and kind of bringing the residue of some of these sources in, sometimes in a way that might be a little recognizable, more so often not usually, and then also photos that I'll take, often for a lot of the scenery.
Where are you taking, I meant to ask you this when we were working together, where are you taking the photos? Are you outside? Are you...
Well, the flowers in that piece were from just, a potted, night sky petunia plant I have, and so sometimes it's something like that. Different outside, a lot of outdoor, a lot of the nature is photos that I take. But, and that process has kind of also evolved as even the internet and Photoshop has changed over 15 years. It was different.
But this was your first process 15 years ago. The same kind of, would you say it's evolved, or?
It was, and I think it's just gotten more complicated. And, the internet, the algorithm of searching has gotten has gotten more interesting, honestly. And, the way you can search by image and, okay, if you want a leg that is in this position, you can start Googling people doing this other activity that looks kind of like this, if someone's getting on a horse, is their leg going to be the way I want it to be? And then I see images of, and then it brings me to some other random rabbit hole. And, I kind of have always thought of that almost like rhyming, in poetry, the way that a word choice, if you're searching for a certain meaning, but you want it to rhyme, you might choose a word that you might not have chosen otherwise to fit formally, but then it brings in this other layer of meaning, which I had not had in the original story idea, but becomes, it unlocks something that feels right. So that, the narrative evolves as the image evolves.
Let's, I think, just spend the last kind of few minutes, and then we'll be around, obviously, both of us, so feel free to come up after. But let's talk a little bit. I really love the idea of these couples in this piece representing different aspects of the same relationship, that you're seeing this idea of a spatial, unfolding narrative, but also that you could think of this as one couple throughout time, a little bit like going back to the lithographs and where you have this couple going through these moments. So could we talk a little bit about that? I love that idea, and I always think of that now in terms of kind of if you could look back on this couple and then jump forward in time, and then we don't even get to see them later. So sort of how do you think of that in this narrative? Kind of different aspects of the same people.
Well, I love the way you just described that, because I don't think I even really, had seen it that clearly in my mind, and the contrast to the wedding series where it is so linear, and this piece it's kind of circular and up and down and simultaneous, and I think that is the big departure from the wedding series, but then also having those moments of it, and I do think in the piece there's also these moments of the mother and child, which are kind of removed and on their own plane, and the almost underwater circular area where I was kind of thinking of just obscuring them, and then that kind of bleeds into a scene of trees, so the water in my mind kind of became the sky, but also just kind of abstracted itself, and kind of these moments of periodic connection or isolation in this really indescribable experience, I guess. I don't know if that makes sense, but that is really how I was thinking of it, that the couple holding up the seesaw is this, it's another vantage point on the couple that's on the seesaw, which is, and the couple that with the shooting breast milk and the celebration is another viewpoint on them as well, and then the mother and child, it's kind of removed from all of that in a way.
And I said this in the piece, but I think what's so lovely about it is that there is eroticism to it, but there's also this incredible kind of sweetness and romantic, which does echo that those lithographs.
Right.
In a much less cheesy way, I would say.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's the other thing I guess I, would say is, like, I did not incorporate the wedding series because it didn't resonate with me. You know what I mean? And I think there is, I think just as much as the humor is always important to me, there is, like, the romance is just, very magical to me, I guess, as a visual way to talk about love. That's amazing.
We'll be here for the rest of the
Thank you
evening
so
time.
much. Thank you. Thank you for coming, everyone.